Hey guys, tonight we begin with a question that might surprise you. What if everything you thought you knew about Africa's pyramids was incomplete? What if I told you that while millions flock to see Egypt's 3 famous pyramids at Giza, there's a place not far south where over 250 pyramids stand, largely forgotten by the world? We're heading to Sudan tonight, to a civilization that built more pyramids than the Egyptians themselves, yet somehow slipped through the cracks of popular history. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. I'm always curious whether you're settling in for the night or listening during the day. If you've got personal experience with archaeology, or perhaps served in that part of Africa, or remember when these sites were being excavated and studied in the 1950s and 60s, I'd especially love to hear your stories down below. Your generation lived through history that younger folks only read about. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture this. You're standing in the Nubian desert, about 130 miles northeast of Khartoum, Sudan's capital. The temperature hovers around 40 degrees Celsius, which those of you who remember before we went metric will recognize as over 100 Fahrenheit. The air shimmers with heat, that particular quality of desert atmosphere that makes distant objects seem to float and waver. And rising from the sand before you, stretching as far as you can see in certain directions, are pyramids. Not 3, not 10, but dozens upon dozens of them, clustering in groups, creating what can only be described as pyramid cities of the dead. This is Meroë, one of several pyramid fields in Sudan, and it represents something that somehow escaped mainstream attention for most of modern history. While Egypt's pyramids became synonymous with ancient civilization itself, photographed, studied, and visited by millions annually, Sudan's pyramids remained largely unknown outside academic circles. Spoiler, that's changing, but slowly. The numbers tell a story that should have been headline news. Egypt, with its 3 great pyramids at Giza and roughly 140 others scattered along the Nile Valley, possesses approximately 143 pyramids total. Sudan? Over 250, more than Egypt, more than any other nation on earth. Built across a span of nearly 1,000 years by a civilization called Kush, later known as Meroë, these structures represent an independent African architectural tradition that paralleled and sometimes influenced their better-known northern neighbors. But here's where it gets interesting for tonight's journey. These aren't just Egyptian pyramids built a bit further south. The Kushite pyramids are distinctly different, architecturally and culturally. They're steeper, smaller, built with different materials and techniques, and they served a civilization that, while influenced by Egypt, developed its own unique identity, language, religion, and artistic tradition. They represent Africa's other pyramid builders, a powerful kingdom that at one point actually conquered Egypt itself and ruled as pharaohs for nearly a century. Those of you who remember the 1950s and 60s might recall when these sites were first being seriously excavated and studied by Western archaeologists. The work of scholars like George Reisner, who worked at Meroë in the early 20th century, slowly began revealing this forgotten chapter of African history. If you happen to read about these discoveries in National Geographic or other publications from that era, I'd be curious to hear your memories in the comments. The question that hangs over this landscape is simple but profound. How did a civilization that built over 250 pyramids, that ruled Egypt itself for a time, that developed its own writing system and traded with civilizations from the Mediterranean to sub-Saharan Africa, somehow become a footnote in popular understanding of ancient history? Tonight, we're going to answer that question. We're going to walk through the rise of Kush, explore these remarkable pyramids in detail, understand the people who built them, and examine why they matter. It's going to take us a while, but then again, we've got all night. To understand why pyramids rose in Sudan, we need to understand the land itself. Nubia, as this region was known to the ancients, occupies the Nile Valley south of Egypt, stretching from the first cataract at Aswan southward through modern Sudan. The term Nubia likely derives from the Egyptian word nebu, meaning gold, and for good reason. This was gold country, rich in the precious metal that would fund kingdoms and attract the envy of neighbors for millennia. The geography here is harsher than Egypt, where the Nile flows relatively smoothly through Egyptian territory. In Nubia, it's interrupted by 6 major cataracts, essentially rapids and rocky barriers that made river navigation challenging and sometimes impossible. These cataracts divided the region into distinct zones and would play a crucial role in shaping political boundaries throughout ancient history. Between the first and second cataracts lay Lower Nubia, a relatively narrow strip of arable land that would eventually become the border zone between Egyptian and Kushite power. Above the second cataract, the valley widens somewhat, and here in Upper Nubia, the early Kushite kingdoms would take root. The land was never as agriculturally rich as Egypt's broad delta and floodplain, which meant Nubian kingdoms had to look to other sources of wealth. Trade became essential. Gold became currency, and control of trade routes became power. The people who settled this region were distinct from Egyptians, though the two cultures would interact, influence, and occasionally conquer each other throughout their long histories. Archaeological evidence suggests human habitation in Nubia dating back at least 300,000 years, with settled agricultural communities appearing by 5000 BCE. These were the ancestors of the Kushites, developing their own pottery styles, burial customs, and social structures long before Egypt's first dynasty united under a single pharaoh. By 1800 BCE, a powerful kingdom had emerged, centered at Kerma, above the third cataract. The kingdom of Kerma built impressive fortifications, developed sophisticated bronze working, and traded extensively with Egypt. Their burial practices already showed a taste for monumental expression, with large tumuli, earthen burial mounds covering elaborate wooden structures. Though pyramids hadn't yet appeared in their architectural vocabulary, the Kerma civilization would eventually fall to Egyptian conquest during the New Kingdom period, around 1500 BCE, when pharaohs like Thutmose III campaigned southward, seeking gold and control of trade routes. For several centuries, Nubia became an Egyptian province. But empires rise and fall, and Egypt's new kingdom eventually weakened. Around 1050 BCE, as Egypt entered its third intermediate period, fragmented into rival dynasties and foreign rulers, opportunity opened for Nubian independence. This is where our story truly begins, because from this power vacuum would emerge the kingdom of Kush, the civilization that would eventually build those 250 pyramids we're here to discuss. The new Kushite kingdom established its capital at Napata, strategically located near the Fourth Cataract and beneath a distinctive flat-topped mountain called Jebel Barkal. This mountain wasn't chosen randomly. Its unique pinnacle of rock, rising from one end like a natural obelisk, was believed to house the god Amun, making Napata not just a political capital, but a religious center of tremendous importance. The Kushite rulers of Napata called themselves kings, adopted Egyptian royal titularian customs, and worshipped Egyptian gods, particularly Amun. But make no mistake, this wasn't simple copying. The Kushites were selectively adopting elements of Egyptian culture while maintaining distinct Nubian traditions, creating a hybrid civilization that saw itself as the legitimate heir to ancient Egyptian glory, perhaps more so than the Egyptians themselves, who now lived under divided and sometimes foreign rule. Around 747 BCE, a Kushite king named Kashta began extending his power northward into Egypt itself. His son, Piye, completed what Kashta started, launching a military campaign that would culminate in the conquest of all Egypt. Imagine the audacity, the former province conquering the empire, the student surpassing the teacher. In 728 BCE, Piye marched north with his army and systematically defeated the various Egyptian rulers who had carved up the country among themselves. His victory stele, discovered at Jebel Barkal, describes the campaign in detail, and it's worth noting that Piye showed considerable mercy to defeated enemies who submitted while being ruthlessly efficient with those who resisted. Piye's successors, particularly his brother Shabaka, and later kings Shabitku and Taharka, would rule Egypt as the 25th dynasty, also called the Nubian dynasty or Ethiopian dynasty in ancient texts, though Ethiopia here referred to Kush, not the modern nation of Ethiopia. These Kushite pharaohs ruled from around 712 to 664 BCE, controlling both Egypt and Nubia, creating an empire that stretched from the Mediterranean to deep into sub-Saharan Africa. Those of you who served will appreciate what a logistical achievement this represented. An army marching from Nubia into Egypt, maintaining supply lines, coordinating multiple forces, and then governing the vast territory they conquered. This wasn't a raid. This was conquest, administration, and rule that lasted nearly 50 years. The 25th dynasty is particularly interesting because these Kushite pharaohs saw themselves as restorers of traditional Egyptian values. Where previous rulers had let temples decay and neglected religious observances, the Kushites poured resources into restoration and construction projects. They commissioned new temples, repaired old ones, and generally presented themselves as more Egyptian than the Egyptians, at least in terms of religious orthodoxy. Ironic, perhaps, that outsiders would become the guardians of tradition? But history has seen stranger turns. Their reign ended not through internal collapse, but external invasion. The Assyrian Empire, at the height of its power and military technology, began pushing into the Levant and eventually Egypt. Around 671 BCE, the Assyrian king Esarhaddon invaded Egypt. Taharka, the Kushite pharaoh, initially repelled the attack, but a second Assyrian invasion in 667 BCE proved more successful. Taharqa retreated to Nubia. His nephew Tanutaman briefly recaptured Memphis, but by 664 BCE, the Assyrians had decisively expelled Kushite power from Egypt. The 25th dynasty was over. But here's the crucial point. Retreat from Egypt wasn't the end of Kush. It was, in many ways, a new beginning. The Kushite kings returned to Nubia, yes, but they didn't dissolve into obscurity. They continued ruling a still prosperous kingdom, and it's after their expulsion from Egypt that Kushite culture truly flourished independently, developing those distinctive features, including the pyramid building tradition, that make it so fascinating. Egypt had been the pinnacle, but Nubia would be the foundation of their true legacy. Now we come to the pyramids themselves, and the first thing to understand is how different they are from their Egyptian cousins. Stand in front of the Great Pyramid of Khufu at Giza, and you're looking at a structure with sides that slope at roughly 52 degrees. Stand in front of a Kushite pyramid at Meroë, and you're looking at slopes approaching 70 degrees. The difference is immediately striking. Egyptian pyramids sit on the landscape with monumental stability. Kushite pyramids leap skyward with dramatic verticality. This wasn't an accident or inability to copy Egyptian designs. The Kushites could build Egyptian-style pyramids if they wanted. They chose not to. The steep angle was deliberate, creating a distinctly Kushite architectural identity. These pyramids were typically smaller than Egyptian examples, ranging from about 20 feet to around 100 feet in height, with base dimensions similarly modest compared to Egypt's massive structures. But what they lacked in size, they made up in numbers and in the visual drama of that steep ascent. Construction materials differed as well. Where Egyptian pyramids were built primarily from limestone and the Great Pyramid used granite for internal chambers, Kushite pyramids were built mainly from sandstone, locally quarried from Nubian desert sources. Sandstone is softer than limestone or granite, easier to cut and shape, but also more vulnerable to erosion over millennia. This partly explains why Kushite pyramids show more weathering than their Egyptian counterparts, though looting and deliberate destruction have also taken their toll. The construction technique appears to have involved cutting blocks to fit without mortar, similar to Egyptian methods, though the evidence suggests less precision in fitting than the tight joints famous at Giza. The steep angle meant less stone volume overall, making construction faster and requiring fewer resources. A typical Kushite pyramid might take months rather than the decades required for Egypt's largest monuments. This allowed the civilization to build many more of them over time. One of the most distinctive features of Kushite pyramids is the pyramid chapel that sits at the eastern face of each structure. These small temples, built directly against the pyramid's base, contained offering tables, carved reliefs, and hieroglyphic inscriptions describing the deceased rulers' names, titles, and sometimes accomplishments. The chapel served as the focal point for mortuary cult activities, where offerings would be made to sustain the deceased in the afterlife. The chapels themselves are architecturally fascinating. They typically feature a small porch or forecourt, a main chamber, and sometimes additional rooms. The walls are covered with relief carvings showing the deceased receiving offerings, interacting with gods, or engaged in activities reflecting their status. The artistic style is immediately recognizable as related to Egyptian art, but distinctly different. Proportions are slightly different. Certain conventions are followed, while others are ignored or modified. It's the work of artists trained in an Egyptian-influenced tradition who have developed their own aesthetic. Those who appreciate craftsmanship will understand what this represents. These weren't crude copies made by people who didn't understand Egyptian art. These were skilled artisans who understood Egyptian conventions perfectly well and chose to modify them, creating something that honored the source while asserting independence. It's sophisticated cultural expression through artistic choice. The earliest Kushite pyramids appeared at El Karu, near Napata, around 650 BCE. Contemporary with, or just after the 25th dynasty's rule of Egypt, King Piye, who conquered Egypt, was buried under a pyramid at El Karu, though his actual tomb chamber was cut into bedrock beneath and behind the pyramid, rather than inside it. This pattern, a pyramid as superstructure with a burial chamber cut into rock or built underground separately, would characterize Kushite pyramid construction throughout its history. Over the next several centuries, pyramid construction continued at El Karu and then at nearby Meroë, where pyramids grew larger and more elaborate. But the real flowering of Kushite pyramid building would come after a major shift in the kingdom's geography and focus, a shift that would give these structures their most famous location, Meroë. Sometime around 590 BCE, the royal capital of Kush shifted from Napata southward to Meroë, located between the 5th and 6th cataracts. The reasons for this move are debated by historians, but several factors likely contributed. Napata sat close to Egypt, convenient when the Kushites ruled there, but increasingly vulnerable once they didn't. Egyptian raids could reach Napata relatively easily. Meroë, further south, offered greater security from northern threats. But security wasn't the only advantage. Meroë's location provided better access to sub-Saharan African trade routes, goods coming from Central Africa, iron from local smelting operations, timber from regions with better rainfall, all flowed more naturally through Meroë than through Napata. The city also sat in a region with somewhat higher rainfall than the hyper-arid zones further north, supporting more extensive agriculture and pastoral activities. It was, in many ways, a better capital for a kingdom looking south and east, rather than fixating northward on Egypt. The move to Meroë marks what historians call the Meroitic period, running from roughly 590 BCE to around 350 CE, nearly 1,000 years of continuous civilization. This is when Kushite culture truly came into its own, developing features that set it apart from Egypt more decisively. And this is when pyramid building reached its peak, with over 200 pyramids eventually constructed in the cemeteries at Meroë and surrounding areas. Meroë became famous in the ancient world for several products and characteristics. Ironworking was a major industry, with archaeological evidence showing extensive smelting operations. The city's iron production was significant enough that early excavators called Meroë the Birmingham of Africa, comparing it to the British industrial city, though that comparison oversimplifies a complex ancient economy. The city also controlled trade in African goods highly prized in the Mediterranean world: ivory, ebony, exotic animal skins, gold, and probably slaves, though this aspect of ancient economies makes modern audiences uncomfortable, and rightly so. Meroë served as a middleman, connecting the Mediterranean economies with sub-Saharan sources, and this trade generated considerable wealth. That wealth-funded pyramid construction, temple building, and the elaborate royal court that characterized Meroitic civilization at its height. The archaeological site of Meroë today reveals a substantial ancient city. In addition to the pyramid fields, there are ruins of temples, palaces, public buildings, and what appears to have been a royal bath or swimming pool, the so-called Roman bath, though its actual purpose remains debated. The city clearly had substantial infrastructure supporting a population that may have reached 20 to 30,000 people at its peak. Substantial for an ancient African city. 3 main pyramid cemeteries served Meroë. The North Cemetery, containing over 40 pyramids of kings and queens. The South Cemetery, with at least 200 pyramids of other royal family members and high officials. And the West Cemetery, also containing royal burials. These weren't built all at once, but accumulated over the roughly 1,000 years of the Meroitic period. A steady accumulation of royal monuments that eventually created the landscape we see today. Pyramid construction at Meroë shows evolution over time. Earlier pyramids tend to be larger and more substantial. Later ones, particularly from the final centuries of Kushite civilization, are often smaller and built less carefully, suggesting either declining resources, changing priorities, or shifts in religious beliefs about funerary monuments. By the time the kingdom fell around 350 CE, pyramid building had essentially ceased, and the last structures show signs of abbreviated effort compared to the confident monuments of the civilization's zenith. If you happen to read about early excavations at Meroë in the 1920s and 30s, you might remember the name George Reisner, the American Egyptologist who worked there. Reisner's methods were advanced for his time, though by modern standards, his excavation techniques were crude, and his interpretations often reflected colonial-era biases. He tended to attribute anything sophisticated in Kushite culture to Egyptian influence, underestimating Meroitic innovation and independence. Later archaeologists have had to work hard to overcome this framework and recognize Kushite civilization on its own terms. Let's talk about how these pyramids were actually built, because while the general principle is straightforward, the practical execution required considerable skill and organization. First, a level foundation had to be established on the rocky desert surface where these pyramids stand. This meant clearing sand, sometimes cutting into bedrock and creating a square platform oriented to the cardinal directions. Those who've done construction know that getting a large square perfectly level and aligned isn't trivial even with modern tools. The Kushite builders used simple technologies: plumb bobs, leveling with water-filled trenches, sighting along ropes, but applied them with precision. The pyramid core was typically built from roughly cut sandstone rubble, essentially filling material that didn't need to be precisely shaped. The outer casing blocks, which created the smooth exterior surface, were more carefully cut and fitted. Many Kushite pyramids have lost their casing stones over the centuries, either to erosion, earthquake damage, or human removal for reuse in other construction. This gives them a stepped or irregular appearance today that doesn't reflect their original smooth-sided glory. For a steep 70-degree angle, the construction technique probably involved building up courses of stone in slightly set-back layers, creating a stepped profile that was then filled and smoothed with casing stones to create the continuous slope. The steep angle meant each layer didn't need to extend far back from the layer below, reducing the total volume of stone required, but increasing the structural challenge of keeping everything stable at such a dramatic incline. The entrance to the pyramid was typically on the eastern face, leading to a descending passage that ran either into the pyramid's core or, more commonly, downward into the bedrock beneath the structure. This subterranean approach made tomb robbing slightly more difficult, though ultimately, it didn't prevent it. Nearly all Kushite pyramids were looted in antiquity, their contents removed either by organized professional tomb robbers or perhaps even by later generations of Kushites themselves during periods of economic distress or political chaos. Inside the burial chamber, we find evidence of how these tombs were used. Bodies were typically placed on wooden burial beds, or, in later periods, in pottery coffins or stone sarcophagi. The deceased was accompanied by grave goods, jewelry, weapons, pottery vessels containing food and drink offerings, shabtis or servant figures to serve in the afterlife, and sometimes elaborate furniture or chariots. Queens were buried with the same level of wealth and ceremony as kings, reflecting the relatively high status of royal women in Kushite society, a topic we'll explore more deeply later. The pyramid chapel, built against the eastern face, was integral to the funerary complex. These small structures typically measured about 10 to 15 feet deep and perhaps 20 feet wide, enough space for priests or family members to enter and perform offering rituals. The front featured columns or pilasters, often with carved capitals, showing lotus or papyrus designs borrowed from Egyptian architecture. The walls were covered with carved and painted reliefs showing the deceased in various ritual contexts, receiving offerings, worshiping gods, or engaged in activities reflecting their earthly status. Interestingly, many chapel reliefs show the deceased facing left, when Egyptian convention would typically have them facing right. Another small but significant way Kushite art diverged from Egyptian norms. These aren't mistakes or misunderstandings. They're deliberate artistic choices, the kind of subtle rebellion that demonstrates cultural confidence. We understand the rules well enough to know when we're breaking them. The capstone, or pyramidion, topped each pyramid and appears to have been carved from a single block of stone, sometimes showing carved and painted religious symbols or scenes. Few of these capstones remain in place today, victims of earthquake damage, erosion, or deliberate removal. Those that survive, either still on pyramids or found fallen nearby, show careful workmanship and the same steep angle as the pyramid itself, creating a miniature version of the whole structure. Construction of a complete pyramid complex, including the pyramid itself, the burial chambers, and the offering chapel, probably required several months to a year or more, depending on the structure's size and elaboration. This wasn't a massive multi-decade project like Egypt's largest pyramids, but it still represented significant resource investment. Stone had to be quarried, transported, and shaped. Skilled masons had to be employed. Artists had to carve and paint the reliefs. All of this required wealth, organization, and political stability. The fact that Meroë continued building pyramids for nearly 1,000 years speaks to the kingdom's enduring prosperity and the cultural importance placed on proper royal burial. Those who remember when these sites were first being seriously studied might recall the excitement when intact or partially intact tomb goods were discovered. Though most pyramids had been thoroughly looted, occasionally archaeologists found items the ancient robbers missed or deemed not worth taking. These surviving artifacts provide our best evidence for Meroitic material, culture, art, and religious practices. Without them, our understanding of this civilization would be far more limited than it already is. Around 170 BCE, something remarkable happened in Kushite civilization. They developed their own writing system, or more precisely, adapted Egyptian scripts into something distinctly their own. This script, called Meroitic, represents one of the great mysteries of African history because, while we can read it, we cannot fully understand it. Let me explain that apparent contradiction. Meroitic script exists in two forms: a hieroglyphic version used for monumental inscriptions, similar in appearance to Egyptian hieroglyphs, and a cursive version used for everyday writing, more streamlined and faster to write. Both versions represent the same underlying writing system, and scholars have successfully deciphered how to sound out the characters. We know what phonetic values the symbols represent. The problem is the language itself. Meroitic was not a form of Egyptian, despite the use of Egyptian-derived scripts. It appears to have been a Nilo-Saharan language, completely different linguistic family from Egyptian, which was Afro-Asiatic. This means even though we can phonetically read the words, we don't know what most of them mean. It's like being able to pronounce words in a foreign language without knowing their definitions. Frustrating doesn't begin to describe it. We do understand certain aspects of Meroitic texts. Royal names and titles, for instance, are often recognizable because they incorporate Egyptian elements or appear in both Egyptian and Meroitic inscriptions. Certain formulaic phrases in funerary contexts can be understood through comparison with Egyptian equivalents. Words for God, king, queen, and other high-frequency terms have been tentatively identified, but complex sentences, narrative texts, and most everyday writing remain opaque. This is particularly frustrating because a substantial body of Meroitic texts exists. Hundreds of inscriptions on pyramids, temples, offering tables, and stelae, papyri and ostraca, pottery shards used as writing surfaces, with everyday records and communications, all readable in terms of pronunciation but largely meaningless in terms of content. It's like having a library of books in a language with no living speakers and no bilingual dictionaries. The implications of this literacy are significant. Having your own writing system, rather than simply adopting someone else's, represents a level of cultural confidence and administrative sophistication that deserves recognition. This wasn't a civilization that simply borrowed Egyptian culture wholesale. These were people consciously creating their own identity, their own tools for record keeping, their own way of expressing their language and thoughts in permanent form. Scholars have made various attempts to decipher Meroitic fully using comparison with known African languages, statistical analysis, and other linguistic techniques. Some progress has been made, particularly with understanding grammatical structures and identifying certain word types, but a full breakthrough remains elusive. Until a Rosetta Stone equivalent is found, a text that provides extensive translation between Meroitic and a known language, much of what the Kushites wrote will remain mysterious. Those who remember the excitement when Egyptian hieroglyphics were finally deciphered after the Rosetta Stone's discovery in 1799 might appreciate the ongoing frustration with Meroitic. Here we have a writing system that's been partially understood for nearly a century, yet it continues to keep its secrets. History doesn't always cooperate with our desire for neat answers. The pyramid chapels provide some of our best examples of Meroitic inscription. The carved reliefs showing the deceased often include their names, titles, and presumably prayers or offering formulae in Meroitic script. These texts represent the deceased's own language, not borrowed Egyptian, making these monuments trilingual in a sense. The artistic style speaks to Egyptian influence. The architectural form speaks to Kushite tradition. And the inscriptions speak, or would speak, if we could fully understand them, the Meroitic language itself. One of the most fascinating aspects of Kushite civilization, and one that distinguishes it significantly from its Egyptian neighbor, was the prominent role of women in royal power. Meroitic queens weren't simply kings' wives or mothers who exercised informal influence. They were Kandakes, a title often translated as Queen Mother, but representing something far more substantial. Women who ruled in their own right, commissioned their own pyramids, led armies into battle, and exercised full sovereign authority. The word Kandak derives from the Meroitic term Kadke or Kadke, and while the exact meaning is debated, it clearly designated a female ruler of considerable power. Roman and Greek sources mention these queens with a mixture of respect and surprise, reflecting Mediterranean assumptions that women shouldn't rule independently. The Kushites apparently held different views. Several Kandakes are known from historical records and archaeological evidence. Amani-Renas, who ruled around 10 BCE, famously warred with Rome after Augustus conquered Egypt. When Roman forces pushed south from Egypt into Nubia, Amani-Renas led Kushite forces in fierce resistance. She even managed to sack Syene in southern Egypt and carry off statues and loot, including a famous bronze head of Augustus that archaeologists later found buried beneath the steps of a Meroic temple, deliberately placed so people would walk over it. Imagine the psychological statement, the head of Rome's emperor literally underfoot. The subsequent peace negotiations, which took place around 20 BCE, resulted in a favorable treaty for Meroë. Rome agreed to withdraw from Kushite territory and even forgave tribute payments. This was remarkable. A relatively small African kingdom negotiating from strength with the Roman Empire. Much of that strength came from Amani-Renas's determined resistance. She lost an eye in the fighting, earning her the epithet One-Eyed Kandak, but kept her kingdom independent. Other powerful queens include Amani-Shaketo, who ruled around 10 BCE to 1 CE, roughly contemporary with, or slightly after, Amani-Renas. Her pyramid at Meroë was one of the largest and most elaborate. When Italian adventurer Giuseppe Ferlini excavated it in 1834, using destructive methods that horrify modern archaeologists, he found a substantial treasury of gold jewelry, much of which is now in museums in Berlin and Munich. The quality and quantity of these items demonstrate both the wealth available to Kushite royalty and the specific importance of this individual queen. Amanitore, who ruled with her husband Natakamani around 1 to 20 CE, commissioned extensive building projects, including the Lion Temple at Naga, one of the best preserved Meroitic temples. Inscriptions and reliefs show her as equal partner in rule, not subordinate. This partnership pattern appears repeatedly in Meroitic history, with royal couples ruling together, the queen's authority independent rather than derived from her husband. Why did Kushite society afford women such prominent positions when most ancient civilizations, including Egypt for the most part, restricted women to subordinate roles? We don't know for certain. Matrilineal succession patterns may have played a role, with royal legitimacy passing through the female line. Religious beliefs about goddesses and female divine power may have created ideological justification for female rulers. Economic independence through control of property may have given women leverage. Or perhaps it simply reflected cultural values that saw women's leadership as natural and proper. Whatever the cause, the result was a civilization where women could achieve the highest levels of power and receive the same honors in death as men. Royal women commissioned their own pyramids, received the same funerary rituals, and were remembered with the same respect as kings. Their pyramid chapels show them receiving offerings, wearing royal regalia, and interacting with gods in the same ways male rulers did. This wasn't tokenism or exception. It was cultural norm. Those who remember when women's history was beginning to receive serious scholarly attention in the 1960s and 70s might appreciate how important the Kandaks are for understanding gender possibilities in ancient societies. These weren't mythological warrior queens or exceptional outliers. They were documented historical rulers who governed for generations as a normal feature of Kushite political life. They challenge assumptions about what was possible in the ancient world. Modern Sudan has embraced the Kandakis as symbols of national pride and female empowerment. Images of these queens appear in public art, on currency, and in popular culture. They represent both historical fact and contemporary aspiration, connecting past glory to present identity. Meroë's prosperity depended on trade, and understanding the kingdom's commercial networks helps explain both its wealth and its longevity. The city sat at the intersection of multiple trade routes, connecting the Mediterranean world to sub-Saharan Africa, the Red Sea coast to the Nile Valley, and Near Eastern markets to African sources of raw materials. From the south came gold, ivory, ebony, exotic animal skins, incense, and probably enslaved people. Though ancient economies' dependence on slavery remains one of history's darkest aspects, these goods moved northward through Meroitic territory, where merchants and royal officials took their share through trade, taxation, or direct control of production. Ivory, particularly elephant ivory, was highly prized in the Roman world for furniture inlay, decorative carving, and luxury items. Meroë controlled access to important elephant hunting grounds. Further south, from the north and east, came Mediterranean manufactures: wine, olive oil, glassware, fine ceramics, bronze and silver work, and luxury textiles. Roman amphora shards found at Meroitic sites demonstrate trade connections with Egypt and beyond. Glass bottles, bronze vessels, and other imported items appear in elite tombs, showing that Meroitic royalty consumed goods from across the known world. Meroë also exported its own manufactured goods. Iron was a major product, with evidence of extensive smelting operations. Pottery in distinctive Meroitic styles has been found throughout Nubia and even in Egypt, suggesting Meroitic ceramics were trade items rather than just local products. Textiles, though they've rarely survived in the archaeological record, were probably another significant export. The routes themselves are worth understanding. The Nile provided the obvious north-south connection, though its cataracts made continuous river transport impossible. Goods had to be unloaded, carried overland, past the rapids, and reloaded on the other side. This transshipment created opportunities for local control and taxation. Whoever controlled the cataract zones controlled trade. Overland routes also connected Meroë to the Red Sea coast, probably following ancient tracks through the desert. From Red Sea ports, goods could be shipped to Arabia, India, and further east, connecting Meroë to the Indian Ocean trade network that linked Africa, Arabia, India, and ultimately Southeast Asia. Meroitic pottery has been found in Red Sea port sites, suggesting this trade was substantial. Those who remember reading about ancient trade routes, perhaps in school geography or history classes in the 1940s and 50s, might recall that these networks were older and more extensive than popular imagination often assumes. Long before European colonization, long before the Islamic conquests, African kingdoms were trading with Mediterranean and Asian civilizations, exchanging goods and ideas across thousands of miles. Meroë was a crucial node in these ancient networks. The wealth this trade generated funded the pyramids, obviously, but also temples, palaces, and the elaborate royal court. It supported specialized craftsmen, gold workers, potters, weavers, stone carvers, scribes. It maintained an army capable of defending the kingdom and occasionally expanding its borders. It allowed Meroitic kings and queens to project power and prestige through monumental architecture and artistic patronage. But trade wealth is vulnerable wealth. When trade routes shift, when political circumstances change, when new competitors emerge, prosperity can evaporate quickly. This vulnerability would eventually contribute to Meroë's decline, though we're getting ahead of ourselves. For now, understand that those pyramids rising from the Nubian desert were built not just with stone and labor, but with profits from a commercial network spanning from Central Africa to the Mediterranean and beyond. Religion permeated Meroitic life, as it did most ancient civilizations, and understanding Kushite religious beliefs helps explain why pyramids mattered so much. The Kushites adopted many Egyptian gods, particularly Amun, who held supreme importance as king of the gods and patron of the royal family. The connection to Amun had been established during the Napata period, when the sacred mountain Jebel Barkal was identified as Amun's earthly throne. But Kushite religion wasn't simply imported Egyptian belief. The Kushites maintained their own indigenous deities, sometimes syncretizing them with Egyptian gods, sometimes worshipping them independently. Aptmak, a lion-headed war god who appears frequently in Meroitic art, has no Egyptian equivalent. He's distinctly Kushite, associated with warfare, protection, and royal power. Temples dedicated to Aptmak, particularly the famous Lion Temple at Naga, show this god in various forms, sometimes with 3 heads, often holding weapons and captives. The Lion Temple itself is worth describing. Built during the reign of Queen Amenemoret and King Natakamani, it features a long exterior wall carved with relief scenes showing Epidemic in his 3-headed form, flanked by the royal couple who appear equal in size and importance. The artistic style mixes Egyptian conventions with Meroitic innovations and even shows some Hellenistic and Roman influence in certain details, demonstrating how Meroë absorbed and adapted multiple cultural influences. Isis, the Egyptian goddess of magic and motherhood, was also prominent in Kushite religion. Several temples dedicated to Isis have been found in Meroitic territories, and her image appears frequently in pyramid chapels and other funerary contexts. The synthesis of Egyptian goddess worship with Kushite traditions created a religious system that honored multiple cultural sources while creating something distinctly Meroitic. Animal worship played an important role. Beyond Epidemic's lion associations, rams were sacred to Amun and appear frequently in Meroitic art and architecture, particularly the ram sphinx statues that guard temple entrances. Elephants, important economically for ivory, also had religious significance. Snakes, associated with both protection and danger, appear in various religious contexts. The afterlife beliefs that motivated pyramid construction drew heavily on Egyptian concepts, but with Meroitic modifications, the deceased needed a preserved body, tomb, and grave goods to support their existence in the afterlife. Offering rituals performed in the pyramid chapels provided sustenance for the deceased's spirit. The pyramid itself served as a symbolic link between earth and sky, helping the deceased ascend to join the gods. Funerary texts in Meroitic script, which we cannot fully translate, presumably contained prayers, spells, or instructions similar to Egyptian texts, like the Book of the Dead. Without translation, we can only guess at their specific content, but their prominent placement in tomb contexts makes their general purpose clear. These were texts meant to protect, guide, and sustain the deceased in their afterlife journey. Royal coronations and major religious festivals would have been spectacular events, though we have limited direct evidence for their specifics. Egyptian parallels suggest elaborate processions, offerings to gods, public ceremonies affirming the ruler's divine selection, and feasting. The Kandakis and kings derived authority partly from their religious roles as intermediaries between gods and people, making public religious performance politically important. Those interested in comparative religion might note that Kushite beliefs combined elements familiar from multiple sources: Egyptian, Sub-Saharan African, and even Mediterranean influences into a system that served Meroitic societies' specific needs. This wasn't confused syncretism, but deliberate religious construction, taking useful elements from various sources and creating coherent local practice. Religious flexibility often indicates cultural confidence rather than confusion. While pyramids dominate our attention, most Meroitic people never commissioned one and didn't spend their days thinking about royal burials. Let's talk about daily life for the majority of the population, because understanding ordinary existence provides context for the extraordinary monuments. Most people lived in mud brick houses, clustered in neighborhoods. A typical house might have 2 or 3 rooms, flat roof, small courtyard, perhaps a cooking area separate from sleeping spaces. The wealthy had larger houses with more rooms, courtyards with wells, possibly second stories. But even elite housing was modest by modern standards. Climate-dictated design, thick mud walls for insulation, small windows to keep out harsh sun, flat roofs that could be used as additional living space during cooler evenings. Water came from the Nile or from wells. Women typically handled water carrying, as they did in most ancient societies, hauling heavy clay jars on their heads or shoulders. If you've ever carried 5 gallons of water even a short distance, you understand the physical labor this represented. Daily, multiple trips, in heat that frequently exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Food consisted primarily of cultivated grains, sorghum and millet being staples, supplemented by vegetables, dates, some fish from the Nile, and for those who could afford it, meat from cattle, sheep, or goats. Bread and beer, made from similar fermentation processes, provided basic nutrition. Those familiar with agricultural life will recognize this as a largely vegetarian diet by necessity rather than choice, with meat being relatively rare except for the wealthy or on special occasions. Cooking was done over open fires or in clay ovens. Women ground grain with stone mills, a labor-intensive process that wore down tooth enamel, as skeletal remains of Meroitic people clearly show. Food storage was a constant challenge in hot climate without refrigeration. Grain had to be protected from insects and rodents. Fresh food had to be consumed quickly or preserved through drying. Clothing was primarily linen, woven locally from flax cultivated along the Nile. Wealthy people wore finer quality linen, sometimes dyed in bright colors, sometimes embroidered or decorated. Common people wore simpler garments, often undyed natural linen color. Jewelry was important across social classes, though obviously the materials varied. Gold for the elite, copper or bronze for the middle classes, shell or bone for the poor. Everyone seems to have worn some personal ornament, suggesting jewelry had social and possibly protective significance beyond mere decoration. Craftsmen worked in specialized areas, potters in pottery quarters, metal workers near smelting operations, weavers often in domestic settings. Archaeological evidence shows clear workshop areas with tool remains, production debris, and sometimes specialized structures for different crafts. This indicates economic specialization and probably guild or family-based organization of production. Trade wasn't just for elite consumption. Market areas provided spaces for exchange of everyday goods, food, pottery, textiles, tools, services. Barter probably dominated over monetary exchange for most transactions, though bronze or copper items may have served as rough currency. The economy operated at multiple levels simultaneously: large-scale international trade in luxury goods, regional exchange of agricultural and craft products, and local barter of necessities. Children's lives varied by class. Elite children likely received education in reading Meroitic script, religious training, and practical skills needed for their social position. Common children probably learned trades through apprenticeship to parents or relatives. Child mortality was high, as it was everywhere in the ancient world. Many people didn't survive childhood, and those who did faced life expectancies by modern standards quite short, perhaps 35 to 40 years average, though some individuals certainly lived much longer. Entertainment and leisure activities leave less archaeological trace than architecture or tools, but we know some elements. Music, evidenced by finding musical instruments in tombs and depictions in art. Dance, similarly shown in various artistic contexts. Public festivals and religious ceremonies provided both spiritual and entertainment functions. Storytelling, though leaving no physical evidence, surely existed as it does in all oral cultures. Board games, simple ball games, and other recreational activities probably existed, though specific evidence is limited. Military service was another aspect of life, particularly for men. Meroë maintained an army throughout its existence, necessary for defense against occasional Egyptian or Roman incursions, and for controlling its own territories. Military equipment found in tombs, particularly weapons and archery gear, demonstrates that warfare was a significant part of Meroitic society. Veterans of those of you who served will recognize that some things about military life probably haven't changed much. Hierarchy, discipline, training, camaraderie, hardship, and pride in service. The point here is that Meroitic civilization wasn't just pyramids and gold treasure. It was people living ordinary lives, working, raising families, worshiping gods, conducting business, and dying, all within a cultural framework that happened to produce extraordinary monuments. Understanding the daily context makes the pyramids more impressive, not less, because they represent surplus wealth and social organization that supported both ordinary life and extraordinary achievement. All civilizations eventually decline, and Meroë was no exception. By the mid-3rd century CE, signs of stress were appearing. Pyramid construction continued, but on a reduced scale, with later pyramids noticeably smaller and less carefully built than earlier examples. This suggests declining resources, changing priorities, or both. Multiple factors probably contributed to Meroë's decline, and as usual in complex historical processes, isolating a single cause is impossible. Environmental changes may have played a role. There's evidence that the region became increasingly arid during the late Meroitic period, making agriculture more difficult and reducing the carrying capacity of the land. Overgrazing and deforestation for iron smelting may have worsened environmental degradation. Trade route shifts likely mattered significantly. The rise of Aksum, a powerful kingdom in what's now Ethiopia, created competition for Red Sea trade. Aksumite merchants and rulers gradually captured trade routes and commercial networks that had previously benefited Meroë. Additionally, Roman Egypt's relationship with Meroë cooled over time, and direct Roman trade with sub-Saharan regions via alternative routes may have bypassed Meroë entirely. Political instability may have weakened the kingdom from within. We have limited evidence for Meroë's final centuries, but what exists suggests possible succession disputes and fragmenting royal authority. When pyramid construction becomes erratic and quality declines, it often signals broader social and political problems. Around 350 CE, Meroë appears to have been conquered or overrun by Aksumite forces under King Ezana. Aksumite inscriptions claim victory over the Noba and Kasu, probably referring to Nubian groups including the Meroites. Whether this was a decisive military conquest or simply the final blow to an already failing kingdom is debated. Archaeological evidence shows burning and destruction at some Meroitic sites during this period, but also evidence of gradual abandonment rather than catastrophic collapse. What we know for certain is that by 400 CE, Meroë as a political entity had ceased to exist. The capital was abandoned. Pyramid construction stopped. The distinctive Meroitic culture fragmented. 3 successor kingdoms emerged in Nubia, Nobatia, Makuria, and Alodia, but these were Christian kingdoms with different languages, cultures, and architectural traditions. The Pyramid Age was over. The population didn't disappear. Nubian people continued living in the region, obviously, but the specific political, cultural, and artistic complex we call Meroë or Kush ended. The pyramids stood empty, their chapels no longer receiving offerings, their inscriptions no longer read by people who understood Meroitic script. Over centuries, sand buried many structures partially. Earthquakes toppled capstones and damaged walls. Treasure hunters looted the tombs, seeking gold and portable valuables. Those who remember the end of World War II, or the fall of European colonial empires, or the collapse of the Soviet Union, understand how great powers can fade faster than seems possible when you're living through their height. Meroë had ruled for nearly 1,000 years. Then it was gone, leaving pyramids in the desert as its most visible legacy. The Christian Nubian kingdoms that succeeded Meroë built churches and monasteries, not pyramids. Their burial practices followed Christian rather than traditional African customs. They wrote in Greek and Coptic and eventually developed their own Christian Nubian language, written in a modified Coptic script. The cultural continuity with Meroë largely broke, though some artistic and architectural elements persisted in modified form. This Christian period lasted from roughly the 6th century to the 14th century, when Islamic expansion from Egypt gradually converted the region. The pyramids, by then over 1,000 years old, stood as mysterious ruins that local populations attributed to supernatural forces or ancient giants having forgotten the civilization that built them. European awareness of Sudan's pyramids came surprisingly late. While Egyptian pyramids had been famous since ancient times, the Nubian pyramids remained largely unknown to Western scholarship until the 19th century. Early European travelers occasionally mentioned pyramids in Sudan, but systematic study didn't begin until after European colonial powers established control in the region. The first major excavation work was conducted by Giuseppe Ferlini, an Italian treasure hunter who worked at Meroë in 1834 and 1835. Ferlini's methods were catastrophically destructive by any standard. He literally demolished the top of Queen Amenisheketo's pyramid, breaking through the structure to access the burial chamber. He found substantial gold treasures, which he removed and later sold to European museums. His work destroyed irreplaceable archaeological context and damaged monuments that had stood for 2,000 years. Those who remember early 20th century attitudes toward archaeology and cultural heritage will recognize that Ferlini's behavior, while shocking now, wasn't unusual for his era. Archaeological sites in colonized regions were often treated as treasure sources rather than cultural heritage to be preserved. The improvement in archaeological ethics has been gradual and is still ongoing. More systematic scientific work began with George Reisner's Harvard University Boston Museum of Fine Arts expedition, which worked in Sudan from 1913 to 1930. 2. Reisner excavated numerous pyramid sites, including Nuri, El Kuru, and later Meroë itself. His methods were relatively advanced for his time, including careful recording, photography, and preservation of finds. However, his interpretations reflected colonial-era assumptions that anything sophisticated in African civilizations must have come from Egypt or other external sources. He consistently underestimated Meroitic independence and innovation. Post-independence Sudanese archaeology has gradually changed this dynamic. Sudanese scholars now lead many excavations, and international collaboration has become more genuinely cooperative than colonial. Modern archaeological techniques, ground-penetrating radar, satellite imaging, careful conservation practices have been applied to Meroitic sites, revealing new information while better preserving what remains. The decipherment of Meroitic script, though still incomplete, has progressed thanks to scholars like Francis Llewellyn Griffith, who worked out the phonetic values of the characters in the early 20th century, and subsequent researchers who've gradually built understanding of grammatical structures. The hope persists that full translation might someday be possible if the right evidence emerges. Modern tourism brings some visitors to Sudan's pyramids, though political instability and limited infrastructure have prevented the mass tourism that Egypt experiences. This has mixed effects: less revenue and international attention, but also less pressure on fragile sites and fewer opportunities for vandalism or inappropriate development. The pyramids at Meroë were designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2011, bringing international recognition and some conservation funding. Those of you interested in archaeology or ancient history might appreciate knowing that work continues. New discoveries still occur regularly. In 2016, a team using satellite imagery and ground surveys identified potential pyramid sites that hadn't been previously documented. In 2019, excavations at one royal tomb revealed painted wall decorations that had survived 2 millennia, providing rare evidence of Meroitic painting techniques and iconography. The challenge for researchers is balancing investigation with preservation. Every excavation damages the site to some degree, even with best intentions. Exposing buried structures to air and light accelerates deterioration. Limited funding means choosing priorities carefully. And political instability in Sudan over recent decades has made long-term research projects difficult, with some seasons' work interrupted or prevented by security concerns. The pyramids themselves face multiple threats. Natural erosion continues, with wind-blown sand gradually wearing down soft sandstone. The relative lack of rainfall in the region actually helps preservation, since water is usually stone's worst enemy. But occasional rain events can cause damage to structures not designed to shed water. Seismic activity, while rare, can damage structures over time. Human threats include vandalism, inappropriate tourism behavior, and potential looting. Though Sudan's remoteness and relatively low visitor numbers reduce these risks compared to more accessible sites. Climate change may increase threats if it brings more extreme weather events or changes local environmental conditions in unpredictable ways. Let's talk about why these pyramids matter and why preserving them presents challenges. On the surface, the answer seems obvious. They're irreplaceable historical monuments, representing an important African civilization. But the practical and ethical complexities of preservation are worth examining. Sudan is not a wealthy nation. It faces significant development challenges, poverty, political instability, limited infrastructure, ongoing internal conflicts. In that context, spending scarce resources on preserving ancient monuments might seem like a luxury the country can't afford. Why prioritize 2,000-year-old pyramids when people need schools, hospitals, clean water, and economic opportunity? This is a legitimate question that applies to archaeological preservation worldwide. The answer involves multiple considerations. Cultural heritage contributes to national identity and pride. It can generate tourism income, though Sudan's political situation has limited this potential. It represents irreplaceable human achievement that, once destroyed, cannot be recreated. And perhaps most importantly, societies that preserve their past demonstrate confidence in their present and future. Heritage preservation isn't opposed to development. It's part of balanced development that includes cultural as well as economic dimensions. International assistance can help, but brings its own complications. Foreign funding and expertise can support preservation when local resources are insufficient. However, external involvement can create dependency, impose foreign priorities over local needs, and raise questions about who truly controls and benefits from cultural heritage. The ideal is genuine partnership, where Sudanese interests remain primary, while international resources and expertise support Sudanese-led efforts. Achieving this ideal is difficult in practice. UNESCO's designation of Meroë as a World Heritage Site theoretically brings international attention and potential funding. However, UNESCO has limited enforcement mechanisms and even less money to directly support preservation. The designation is more symbolic than practical, though symbolism has value in raising awareness. Climate change presents unpredictable threats. While arid conditions generally favor preservation, changing weather patterns could bring more intense rainfall, more extreme temperature fluctuations, or other environmental stresses that ancient structures weren't designed to withstand. Monitoring and responding to climate impacts requires resources and long-term commitment. Local communities near the pyramid sites have complex relationships with these monuments. The pyramids are part of their landscape, familiar since childhood, but may seem to belong more to foreign tourists and archaeologists than to local residents. Including local communities in tourism benefits, employment opportunities at archaeological sites, and decision-making about preservation helps align local interests with conservation goals. When communities benefit from heritage sites, they have incentive to protect them. Education plays a crucial role. Sudanese children should learn about Kushite civilization as part of their national heritage. Developing pride in these achievements and understanding why preservation matters. International education about Sudan's pyramids challenges the Egypt-centric narrative of African pyramid building and African civilization more broadly. Every person who learns about Meroë becomes a potential advocate for its preservation. Documentation is preservation insurance. Detailed measurements, photographs, laser scanning, and other recording techniques create records that can support reconstruction if structures are damaged or destroyed. In worst-case scenarios where physical preservation fails, at least detailed knowledge survives. Several teams have undertaken systematic documentation of Sudan's pyramids using modern technology, creating three-dimensional models and comprehensive photographic records. The ultimate goal is sustainable preservation that balances competing needs. Research that advances knowledge without damaging sites, tourism that generates revenue without overwhelming fragile structures, local community development that includes rather than excludes heritage sites, and international cooperation that respects Sudanese sovereignty while providing necessary support. Those of you who remember when historical preservation was less sophisticated might appreciate how much methodology has advanced. We better understand how monuments deteriorate, how interventions can help or harm, how to balance access and protection. But we also face challenges our predecessors didn't. Climate change, unprecedented population growth, and global connectivity that brings both opportunities and threats. The Kushite pyramids have survived 2,000 years. Whether they survive another 2,000 depends on choices made now and in coming decades by Sudanese people, international organizations, archaeologists, tourists, and everyone who values irreplaceable human achievement. Let's return to where we started. Why does it matter that Sudan has more pyramids than Egypt? Why should these monuments receive attention beyond specialist circles? The answer goes beyond simple numerical comparison to questions about how we understand African history, whose achievements receive recognition, and what narratives we tell about human civilization. For too long, popular understanding of African history has focused almost exclusively on ancient Egypt, with the rest of the continent treated as somehow separate or lesser. This creates a distorted picture. Egypt was always part of Africa, obviously, but it wasn't the only sophisticated African civilization. The Kushite Kingdom, various West African empires, Great Zimbabwe, Aksum, and many others represent independent African achievements that deserve recognition on their own terms. The Kushite pyramids specifically challenge the monopoly Egypt holds in popular imagination. When people think pyramid, they think Egypt. The Sudanese pyramids force recognition that pyramid building was practiced by multiple African civilizations, that architectural traditions evolved differently in different contexts, and that monumentality wasn't limited to one civilization's golden age. This matters because historical narratives shape contemporary perceptions. When African achievement is reduced to ancient Egypt alone, it reinforces false ideas about African capability and history. When we recognize that Kushite civilization built over 250 pyramids, developed its own writing system, ruled Egypt itself for a time, and maintained independence for a millennium, we complicate and enrich our understanding of African history. Those of you who lived through the civil rights movement and saw how historical narratives were challenged and expanded might recognize similar dynamics here. Historical truth isn't always what was taught initially. Sometimes important aspects were ignored, minimized, or deliberately suppressed. Recovering and recognizing those aspects changes not just history, but present understanding. The Kushite pyramids also demonstrate cultural sophistication in the face of environmental challenge. These weren't built in the most favorable circumstances. The Nubian desert is harsh, resources were more limited than in Egypt's Nile Valley. And yet the Kushites created enduring monuments through ingenuity, organization, and determination. That's a story worth telling about human capability, regardless of circumstances. The independent development of the Meroitic script deserves particular emphasis. Developing a writing system is one of the great achievements of civilization, done independently only a handful of times in human history. That the Kushites created their own script, adapted to their own language, speaks to intellectual sophistication and cultural confidence that deserves recognition alongside other great script inventions. The prominent role of women as rulers, the Kandakis who commissioned pyramids and led armies, challenges assumptions about gender roles in ancient societies. These weren't exceptions or aberrations. They were normal features of Kushite civilization. That's historically significant and relevant to contemporary discussions about women's capabilities in leadership roles. Trade networks connecting Africa to the Mediterranean, Red Sea, and Indian Ocean worlds demonstrate that ancient Africa wasn't isolated or backward, but actively participating in and shaping global exchange systems. The goods, ideas, and technologies that moved through Meroë connected civilizations across continents. Recognizing this challenges parochial views of African history as somehow separate from world history. From a preservation perspective, increasing awareness of Sudan's pyramids can generate support for their conservation. When people know these monuments exist and understand their significance, they're more likely to support efforts to preserve them, whether through direct funding, political pressure on governments and international organizations, or simply spreading knowledge that combats ignorance. The pyramids also connect to contemporary Sudan's national identity. Modern Sudanese can take pride in these achievements as part of their heritage, connecting present to past and asserting historical legitimacy that colonialism tried to deny. Heritage is political, not in a negative sense, but because it relates to identity, dignity, and recognition. We've spent these hours together exploring pyramids that most of the world doesn't know exist. We've traced the rise of Kush from province to power, watched the capital shift from Napata to Meroë, examined the architectural and cultural features that made Kushite civilization distinct, met queens who ruled with authority equal to kings, walked through markets and homes where ordinary people lived their daily lives, and confronted the decline and fall that ended a 1,000-year civilization. The Kushite pyramids stand in the desert now, as they have for 2 millennia, weathered but enduring, damaged but still recognizable, largely unknown but no less significant for their obscurity. They're monuments to human ambition, cultural achievement, and the determination to leave a mark that outlasts individual lives. Every ruler who commissioned a pyramid was making a statement about permanence, about being remembered, about mattering beyond death. In that sense, they succeeded. The pyramids remain. The civilization that built them has vanished, its language only partially understood, its daily life reconstructed imperfectly from fragmentary evidence, its music and stories and jokes lost forever. But the pyramids stand, 250 stone testaments to the kingdom of Kush, proof that this civilization existed, mattered, achieved. Those who've served in the military or worked on large construction projects understand something about legacy. The roads you built, the buildings you erected, the systems you created, they outlast you. They serve purposes you never see, benefit people you never meet, and connect your brief moment of effort to a longer chain of human endeavor. The Kushite pyramid builders achieved that legacy in stone. For us today, these pyramids offer several gifts. First, they expand our understanding of African history beyond the Egypt-centric narrative that has dominated for too long. They demonstrate that pyramid building, writing, trade, urban civilization, and sophisticated political organization weren't Egyptian monopolies, but African capabilities expressed in multiple independent civilizations. Second, they challenge our assumptions about what's important and what gets remembered. 3 pyramids at Giza are world famous. 250 pyramids in Sudan are largely unknown. The difference isn't intrinsic significance, but historical accident, colonial era bias, and the accumulated momentum of established narratives. What else might we be missing because it doesn't fit comfortable stories we've been telling? Third, they remind us that civilizations rise and fall, that prosperity isn't permanent, that even the mightiest kingdoms eventually become ruins and mysteries. This isn't depressing nihilism, but realistic perspective. The Kushites ruled for 1,000 years. That's a long run by any measure. They built monuments that outlasted their civilization by another 1,000 years. That's an achievement worth respecting. Fourth, they pose questions that remain unanswered. The Meroitic script that we can read but cannot fully understand is a perfect metaphor for history itself. We can see the outlines, identify major features, but the full meaning, the nuance, the individual voices and personal experiences, those are lost. History always withholds as much as it reveals. The Kushite pyramids remind us to be humble about what we claim to know. Those of you who've watched the world change over decades, who've seen technologies transform, empires collapse, and new powers rise, understand that history doesn't move in straight lines. The Kushites conquered Egypt, then lost it. They prospered for centuries, then declined. They built pyramids that outlasted their civilization, then disappeared so thoroughly that their writing became incomprehensible to later generations. History is complex, contingent, and often surprising. If tonight's journey stirred memories, whether your own or stories passed down, whether from travels to Africa, from military service in that part of the world, from reading National Geographic in the 50s and 60s when these sites were being excavated, or simply from a lifetime of curiosity about human history, I'd be honored if you shared them below. Your generation's perspective is irreplaceable, connecting these ancient monuments to lived experience in ways books cannot. And in the quiet of history, the Kushite voices still echo, if we're willing to listen. They speak through stone and carved relief, through distinctive artistic choices and architectural innovation, through the dignity they accorded their queens and the ambition they expressed in royal tombs. They tell us that Africa's history includes multiple sophisticated civilizations, that monumentality takes many forms, and that being forgotten by later generations doesn't diminish the reality of what was achieved. The pyramids of Sudan stand as proof. Not as many visit them as should, not as many know they exist as deserve to, but they stand nonetheless, steep-sided and distinctive, 250 stone witnesses to a civilization that mattered, that achieved, that built for eternity, and came as close to achieving it as humans ever do. Now rest well. And I'll see you in the next one when we'll explore another forgotten chapter of history together. The past is vast, and there's always more to discover.